Here we have a piece of negative positive double knitting, and it was begun with a tubular cast on. So there's the lower edge, no visible edge. And when we made the cast on, this green stitch here was one of the cast on stitches, and this red stitch next door was its partner stitch. So this one and this one were a pair of stitches, and those were the stitches we cast onto the needle, and they were cast on to a smaller sized needle. I find it helps to start from a tubular cast on with a needle 1 or 2 increments smaller than you intend for the rest of the project to stop the lower edge from flaring out. Counting from the cast on row, I've got 1, 2, 3 more visible rows of green. So in other words, I've got 4 visible rows of green below my motif. And on the other side, 1, 2, 3, 4 rows of red. So it would be nice at the top of this scarf or object to finish with 4 rows of each colour too. So above my last motif I've got 1, 2, 3 red ones, 1, 2, 3 green ones. And if I just tubularly bind off right now with one colour, I would wind up with 1 more row on one side and 1 row short on the other side. So to make this equal, what I'm going to do is work only my purl stitches and slip my front layer knits as I go. On this next row I'm only going to work the red stitches. I'm going to use my smaller sized needles once again. It's not critical, it doesn't tend to flare as much at the far end, and we can adjust the edge a bit when we sew the bound off stitches. So I'm going to take that, make sure it goes around the green yarn, slip the green stitch, and having that yarn around the green will continue that linked edge. Come to the purl position, purl this stitch. And I'm actually going to change these green stitches. They were alternatively purled on the previous row, so I want them to have normal stitch mount when I come to do my tubular bind off. So I need to keep taking my yarn back to the purl position and purling, take my yarn back, change the stitch mount, take it back, change the stitch mount. The changed stitch mount is because I had used alternative purls throughout this project, but it's easier to graft or do the tubular bind off with normally mounted stitches. At the end of the row I can cut off my red working yarn, and because I was on double pointed needles, all I have to do to get back to my green working yarn is slip the stitches back to the beginning of the needle. If you were on straights, you'd just have to push them from one needle to the next. Now I'm going to cut off my remaining working yarn with about a 4 times the width piece of yarn. That should be sufficient to sew the stitches with no risk of running out. Now I'm ready for the bind off. I'm going to begin by dropping the first front stitch off the needle and just holding it there with my thumb. Then I'm going to enter stitch 2 from front to back. Getting started is always the hardest part. Now I'm going to put stitch 1 back on the needles with normal stitch mount. Then I'm going to go into that as if to knit, and the next one as if to purl. What I'm doing is turning them around so they look like the sides of a stitch. This is a regular graft or Kitchener stitch. Now if I flop the knitting over, and go back in to the first stitch at the far side from the front to the back towards you. Then the next one, go in knitwise from back to front away from you. Then that pairs up the sides of those two stitches. Just watch out that your yarn doesn't go round the side. Roll it back over and come back into the stitch you came out from, front to back, back to front. Take them off the needle once there's a thread through them. Roll it over, back to front, front to back. And now you just have a series of routines, front to back, back to front. And just look at the shapes and how the stitches are laying once you've sewn into them twice. You can see this one still looks funny, but that's because it hasn't had the second pass through it. So when I go into the stitch, I make sure I go into the correct part of it. Use good light. Make sure you can really see what you're doing. And try and adjust the size and shape of the sewn stitches as you go along. It's easier than coming back and adjusting them. I've covered this in greater detail in my DVD. And it's always a bit fiddly to get started, but if you start by dropping that front stitch off to begin with, then you can get into this nice routine of sewing pairs of stitch sides together as you go along the row. Back in here. So this is the whole old stitch. So if we go into there, that's going to complete what looks just like an ordinary stitch that gets sewn in there. And you're completing one more row on the green side. Keep on going, don't pull it too tight, it's easy to over tighten this edge. But now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 green rows after the motif, and 1, 2, 3, 4 red rows after the motif. Everything is nice and equal. At the end we've got one more pair of red stitch sides to do, and then we can go down one more time into that green stitch. You're always sewing back to where the yarn came from. Then we will just adjust the ends, darn everything in, and we are finished.